For 20 years now, Pixar has been responsible for an almost winning streak of movies that entertain kids and adults alike. Each original film manages to deliver an interesting, engaging plot with well-developed characters. In 2013, Pixar released Monsters University, the follow-up prequel to Monsters Inc., which tells the story of how Mike and Sully first met. It reintroduced old characters and explored interesting new characters and ideas. The problem with most sequels, aside from the need to live up to the original film, is that they have to build upon an already existing universe. They have to create new and interesting dynamics between characters without contradicting their old characterizations. And they have to deliver new ideas and plot devices that remain consistent with the source material. As well as Monsters University lives up to the original film, there are several unexplained inconsistencies. In Monsters University, we open on a class of students going on a field trip to Monsters Inc. During this tour, students are guided through a clean, professional factory and look at the scarers with a sense of excitement and idolization. The scarers are treated with a professional sports level of fame. This is further expressed when the team break into Monsters Inc. later in the film and stop to identify them by name and admire them.
Caller Killer Claus Benitez! Look, it's Screaming Bob Gunderson!
The scaring profession is placed in high esteem and requires a high level of education and a graduate degree to perform. It's a highly sought-after job. Contrast this with Monsters Inc., which opens on Mike and Sully waking up and clocking into their grungy day job. If you listen to the music, it portrays the scare floor in a messy industrial tone, resembling olden-day coal mining. During this scene, the monsters are revealed to be all different levels of incompetent.
The kid almost touched me. She got this close to me.
They're afraid to face children.
I won't go in a kid's room! You can't make me!
They're lazy with quarantine safety. And there's a level of indifference when it comes to protocol and paperwork.
Wazowski, you didn't file your paperwork last night.
Another inconsistency is in changing character relationships between movies. In Monsters Inc., Mike and Sully treat Randall as if he's a distant work colleague. This attitude is pretty strange considering Randall was Mike's only friend at one point. Whether they've become friends or enemies through their experiences, it's strange for Mike to refer to Randall as that guy.
One of these days, I am really gonna let you teach that guy a lesson.
The same thing happens with Mr. Snowman, who used to be Mike and Sully's former boss in the mailroom, but is treated as a stranger in Monsters Inc. when they're banished to the Himalayas. And finally, for a straight-up factual error, in Monsters Inc., when Mike and Sully are talking, Mike says,
"You've been jealous of my good looks since the 4th grade, pal."
implying that the two are childhood friends. Monsters University obviously contradicts this statement through the plot when Mike and Sully meet for the first time.
James B. Sullivan.
Mike Wazowski.
When a film creates contradictions like this, sometimes viewing it in a new context can serve as an explanation. For the purpose of this video, let's look at the monster universe from the point of view of Monsters Incorporated, the company. In the monster world, Scream Energy is comparable to the fossil fuel industry. Aside from the fact that Scream Energy is renewable, we have an organization which is largely responsible for delivering all power to the monster world, in the same way that we still rely on oil. For this reason, it's likely to assume that with this comes a lot of money and influence at the industry's disposal. The oil industry does what it can to lobby against restricting regulations so that they can continue to drill oil freely. The Scream industry already produces propaganda to convince the monster world that children are dangerous. The act of dehumanizing children and portraying them as monsters allows for them to be exploited with little to no backlash. The idea of emotionally terrorizing a group of people in exchange for energy is a hard pill to swallow from a moral perspective. By using fear as its driving point with little to no facts to back up their claims, the industry has managed to normalize the idea of scaring children for power through years of propaganda.
We scare because we care.
At the end of the events of Monsters Inc., the Scream industry is in disarray. They've dealt with rising level of quarantine incidents, including 2 employees responsible for kidnapping a child. They've exposed the civilian population to the apparently biohazardous specimen. The long-standing CEO of Monsters Inc. is being prosecuted for attempting to kidnap children to extract their screams, a desperate final attempt to meet the power demand.
I'll kidnap 1,000 children before I let
this company die?
Although Waternoose is the unfortunate middleman in this situation and is made a scapegoat, this whole scandal also points a finger to the industry standards as a whole. Despite no longer scaring children to harvest energy, the company is still exploiting children emotionally, an issue which civilians of Monstropolis are becoming increasingly more informed about, with growing skepticism as to whether children are in fact dangerous.
Hey Mike, this might sound crazy, but I don't think that kid's dangerous.
Monsters Inc. stands on a fragile platform of fear-based public opinion, and so as a natural response to growing uncertainty, the company needs to reinforce their already existing propaganda and repair their public image.
I'm Monsters Incorporated.
What the company needs right now is a distraction, a new focus for their public image. And what better person to do that than the new CEO, the figurehead of Monsters Inc., the renegade whistleblower responsible for bringing the old leadership to justice, idolized for his acts of heroics and discovery of a more humane way to harvest energy. Mike and Sully have become infamous figures in the monster world, beloved by the people, and are currently Monsters Inc.'s most powerful point of influence. It's pretty typical for an organization to fund or at least support the creation of biopics, documentaries, and films which serve as positive PR for their company culture. Over the last 20 years, 9 different films and documentaries have been created which tell the story and ideas of Apple founder Steve Jobs. Although these portrayals aren't always positive ones,
She's not my daughter!
it's safe to say that they've been pretty successful in selling him as some godlike figure. The critically acclaimed film The Social Network tells the story of Facebook's early days from the perspective of CEO Mark Zuckerberg. And the critically panned film The Internship basically serves as a 2-hour advertisement for Google and their internship programs funded by Google. Clearly, organizations are in favor of films which let their company culture shine in a positive light. But what about films produced as a response to scandal, created with the pure purpose of influencing public opinion by pushing biased information? In 2013, FIFA president Sepp Blatter was under investigation by the FIFA Ethics Committee as a response to allegations of illegal payments and internal corruption. In 2014, United Passions was released, a film centered around Sepp Blatter and the governing body of FIFA, showing how they remained incorruptible despite numerous opponents and challenges.
Who makes a sports film where the heroes are the executives?
FIFA funded 90% of the film and originally suggested it be called Men of Legend or The Dream Makers. The movie grossed $918 in its opening weekend, considered to be the worst in US history. It's received a few interesting reviews, including one of the most unwatchable films in recent memory, a dishonest bit of corporate suite sanitizing that's no good even for laughs. The most extraordinary vanity exercise, a vile, self-aggrandizing, sugar-coated pile of manure where Blatter and company managed to make North Korea's Kim Jong-un look self-effacing. Lead actor Tim Roth stated, "Where's all the corruption in the script? Where is all the backstabbing, the deals?" And the director of the film was quoted as saying, "Now I'm seen as the guy who brought AIDS to Africa, or the guy who caused the financial crisis. Apparently I'm a propaganda guy making films for corrupt people." Let's take another look at the context of Monsters University. What if instead of the film being a prequel to Monsters Inc., with all of its contradictions and inconsistencies, it was a standalone film that existed within the Monsters Inc. universe, created as a response to the events of the first movie? Monsters University is a film within a film, a propaganda film. In this situation, any contradictions and inconsistencies are made by the fictional producers, rather than the real producers in the real world. However, when looking back at the contradictions pointed out before, it's clear that not only are these mistakes no longer mistakes, they're intentional decisions made for the purpose of persuading public opinion in the monster world. For example, Scream Energy is clearly a blue-collar industry as presented in Monsters Inc., with shortages in trained workers and an indifference towards standards and protocol. If anything, a decade earlier, the industry would be in an even less professional condition. The portrayal of the scarers as professional, educated, even idolized, is an attempt to rebrand scaring as an attractive career path, to encourage young monsters to pursue scaring. This is further shown by the fact that Mike and Sully didn't need to graduate from Monsters University to get their dream job. It seems that a degree in scaring is an optional qualification, clearly not needed in a world where competent scarers are hard to come by. Showing Mike and Sully abandon university to work in a mailroom further portrays their renegade spirit, and their tendency to go against the status quo. They are truly the relatable underdogs who started from the bottom and worked their way to the top through hard work. Why were the characters like Randall and Mr. Snowman featured in the film, despite having little to no involvement with Mike and Sully until the scandal happened? Well, in the middle of any scandal, people look towards the main players involved. They become famous, familiar faces as a result of excessive press coverage. It's pretty typical for biopics to shoehorn in familiar faces, making them more relevant to a story than they actually were. Does anyone else remember in 2016 when American Crime Story aired? It was a 10-episode series that followed the prosecution of O.J. Simpson, and even though the Kardashian kids were kids at the time, with no involvement in the trials whatsoever, they were shoehorned in due to their current fame and relevance.
Fame is fleeting, it's hollow. It means nothing at all without a virtuous heart.
Biopics rely on real-world fame to garner interest, and so if they notice a familiar face crossing paths with the story, however remote, why wouldn't they capitalize on that?
This is kind of a sellout, right? That they're adding the Kardashian girls into the movie.
In Monsters Inc., Mike says,
You've been jealous of my good looks since the 4th grade, pal.
and yet in Monsters Uni, they create a new story where the two are introduced at university. Firstly, biopics are dramatizations of real life. They're based on true events, but typically alter details for the purpose of serving a more interesting story arc. But perhaps the main reason the two meet at university is to place the world of scaring at the center of their friendship. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak represent two clashing philosophies which led to the ultimate success of Apple. One had a focus on technological innovation and programming, and one had a focus on business, design, and company image.
You're not an engineer. You're not a designer.
The film takes a look at their clashing ideologies and how it formed the modern company.
What do you do?
At the heart of Monsters University are two clashing ideologies. A focus on paperwork and theory versus a focus on raw talent and physical performance. The film goes on to develop a chemistry between Mike and Sully centered around these two clashing ideas. Ultimately, it's the combination of these two ideas which leads to becoming a successful scarer, and this is represented in the friendship formed by Mike and Sully. It seems that Pixar have unintentionally created a perfect example of the way in which powerful, influential organizations use media to persuade public opinion. This may be done to portray a company through an idealized lens. It could provide a human face to an otherwise faceless corporation. Or it can even deliver biased information to serve an agenda. The way in which we perceive the world around us is largely gathered from the media we take in, news, TV, and films. Given enough money and determination, anyone has the ability to alter these forms of media to push their own reality. One of the most effective ways to influence is to appeal to our emotions, our sense of safety,
we power your car, we warm your home, we light your city,
and our sense of fear.
Now is the time to panic!
And so it's important to question information, to view all unfamiliar ideas with a level of skepticism.
It's true! I saw the whole thing!
And to base opinions on a foundation of fact.
No monster in here.
Monsters University serves as a reminder of just how far the power of influence can spread.